Right, I'm Christine McDonald from Rushing River Apiaries, and today we are going to look at all of the equipment that you need to get started in your first year as a beekeeper. We're going to talk about the personal protective equipment, the things that you wear. We're going to talk about the hive itself, all the different components that you need to gather before you can put your bees in there. And we're going to talk about the tools of the trade that you will use every time you do an inspection. And I'll talk through some different options, some DIYs where they exist for making some of these things yourself and trying to reduce the big outpouring of cash that usually accompanies getting bees for the first time. I will start by saying that it's really worthwhile to get to know your local bee supply shop. Instead of trying to find all of these things online through Amazon, for example, you will get the quality that you need from a proper bee supply store. So make those local contacts or find one that is within shipping distance of you online, and you will be much happier with the gear you get from them. So to start, we're going to look at our beekeeper clothing, our personal protective equipment. And I like to recommend that first year beekeepers start out with a full bee suit. So you are protected from neck to wrists down to ankles. It has long legs on it. The reason for that is you want to feel calm and confident when you're working with your bees. And if you have any little bits of anxiety, then you're not going to enjoy it as much as if you are just in a suit of armor. Usually these come with an integrated hood. I'll show you some hood options in a minute. They are almost always light in color, and there's a reason for that. Bees don't like dark colors. So you will usually find them often in white, but you can get some other kind of light shades. And another bonus to wearing a suit is you can see how filthy mine is after one season of wear. It just protects everything that you're going to wear underneath it. So 90% of my beekeeping is done in the full suit option. Now, you can also choose to just get a jacket. And that means you would wear your choice of pants underneath. Blue jeans are not a bad idea. Any kind of like cargo pant is okay. Black tights are not a good idea. Bees don't like black, and they can easily sting through the tights that are clinging to your skin. So with a jacket, again, you are well protected. It's tight at the bottom, and they usually have a little cinch so that you can make sure it stays tight so no bees can get up in your jacket. And then again, they usually have an integrated hood. So this is the same style hood as would be on a suit. Generally, this is called a hood style, and it comes right up over your face, zips right around your neck, so there's no little gaps for bees to get into. So that's another option. The third option for protection is just to wear whatever clothing you want and have a veil that protects your head and face. And so you can get those as well. Not all of them are as beautiful as this one from Bella Beak. Most of them are quite plain, but you get the idea that it just covers kind of your neck and then cinches under your arms to keep any bees from getting up in your face. I actually prefer this hat style veil enough that I wear this with my bee suit. I just find that I get better peripheral vision in this, and this goes for kind of all hat styles, and it keeps the sun from beating off my head, and the brim of the hat keeps the veil from touching my face, which can make me feel a little vulnerable when the bees are cranky. So those are your clothing options. You will also want to protect your hands. And most beekeeping gloves, I could only find a child size one today. Most beekeeping gloves are goat skin for the hand part. And then they have either a canvas or this one is nylon upper that reaches right up to your elbows. So you don't want to leave any room for a gap here between whatever you might be wearing on your arms. That's why they're so long. Make sure to get an appropriate size for yourself. It's worth measuring your hand and comparing it to the size chart so you get one that is going to fit. You'd want it to be snug on your hand because you need the dexterity to work in the hive without being squishing bees all the time. I actually prefer to wear dishwashing gloves. So these are just nitrile gloves from the hardware store. They're only $5, which is nice. These ones are foam lined. You can also get them, it's called flock lined. They're kind of white and fuzzy inside. And I find that these give me much better dexterity. They're snugger to my hand, so I'm not interfering with as many bees. I don't have like the clumsy leather fingertips on. And I get stung far less through these. The bees just don't like to sting them, and it usually stops the stinger before it even touches my skin. So I love these. The only downside is that they're very sweaty. So when I'm working all day, I tend to keep several pairs and rotate through them while I let the other ones dry. So that's your personal protective gear. On your feet, you're going to want to start out with some kind of boot or tall shoe that closes the gap between your pants and your shoe, so that your ankle is not exposed. Although as time goes by and you get more comfortable and it gets hotter out, you might find that the shoes are the first things that you start to compromise on. So that was the clothing. We're going to look now at the tools. What else are you going to have with you when you go out to work the bees? And a couple essential pieces. One is called your hive tool, very original name. They are just a metal tool. On one end, there's a tapered kind of scraper. On the other end, there's a few options. This one is what is called a J-hook. You can see the other end of this one has a lever, and then also whatever this is, it's like a little pick. Really, it comes down to personal preference, what you choose and use. The end that you're going to be using most of the time is just this like tapered lever end. And you might think, especially with your first few inspections, that like, what do I even have this thing for? Because when your box is brand new, everything is just kind of like loose and rattling around in there, and it's quite easy to just pick things up with your hands. But by the end of your first year, you will not be able to inspect a hive without a hive tool. As things get gummed up with propolis in wax, you need to use this to pry the boxes apart. You need to use this to pry the frames apart before you can lift them out. And then the J-hook end actually helps you scoop up a frame to get it out with your hand. So essential tool when I'm working my bees. This stays in my hand full time, even when I am working. This especially, make sure you get it from a bee supply shop and not Amazon. I've seen lots of people break theirs when they're kind of using some leverage. So make sure that you're getting a high quality one from a bee supply store. The other really essential piece of equipment is a bee smoker. Now, if you are brand new to beekeeping, the first thing I want you to do is forget anything that you may have learned from the bee movie about smoke. Smoke does not put bees to sleep. It does not drive them out of the hive. What it does is pushes them down into their honey stores so that you can safely work at the top of the hive without crushing bees. So it's safer for you and it's safer for them. It also masks their alarm pheromones. So when you open the hive, they're not all going to come out thinking intruder, intruder. You have kind of calmed that communication between them so that they don't all get riled up. Now, a couple things to be aware of when you're shopping for a smoker. Again, there are lots of different styles and a lot of it comes down to personal preference. But one thing that I find to be an essential safety piece is the bottom cage. So you can see between these two that one of them, the cage extends down around the bottom, and this one it doesn't. This one burned a hole in our picnic table because I sat it on there when it was full of fuel. This one was right beside it and did not, because the cage keeps that hot part raised just enough. So I would always look for this in a new smoker. Now, of course, you'll need something to burn in here. There are tons of options. I have a great video on how I light a smoker using burlap or cardboard. But something that will make your life a whole lot easier is a propane torch to get your smoker lit in a way that will last your whole inspection. And last but not least, the toolkit of a beekeeper is not that big. The other thing that you're going to want to carry with you, at least most of the time, is a bee brush. This one has synthetic bristles. This one is natural horsehair bristles. These are just for gently removing bees from anywhere you don't want them to be. Usually it's for getting them off me before I take my suit off at the end of an inspection. You can also get them off the edges of the box so that they don't get crushed when you're putting the second box back on top. So a good tool to have in your toolbox. I will add one more thing. This is not an essential, but it's worth a mention in here. This is an EpiPen. I think this is the junior version. Adult ones are a little differently colored. Your reaction to bee stings can change over time. It's good to know when you're starting out beekeeping what your typical reaction is or your normal reaction, but also to understand that some stings are worse than others. Some locations on your body will cause a worse reaction than other. And with more exposure to bee stings, two things can happen. You can either become super desensitized and they don't even really bother you anymore, or you can build up an allergic reaction and suddenly have an anaphylactic reaction. My daughter and I have both had one-off reactions where we've needed epinephrine and we've ended up in the emergency room. Before that, we were fine, and again after that, we were fine. So it's really worth having one. If you can get your doctor to write a prescription for it, then it will be covered by your insurance or pharmacare or whatever you have. If not, then you can just buy them over the counter. They're quite expensive. They only last a year, but really it can be the matter of life or death. So highly recommended. All right, that is the toolkit. Now let's look at the actual kind of hardware where we're keeping our bees. And to do that, we're gonna kind of rebuild this hive that I have in front of me together. So I'll just remove this part for now to show you the bottom board, which is the foundation of this whole thing. So here is my bottom board. There are a couple different types. This one is called a screened bottom board, and this is the type that I recommend. You can also get one that is just solid plywood. Regardless, this is what your hive sits on and kind of encloses the bees from the bottom. You can see if I pull the tray out from here that this one is wire mesh on the bottom. It has a tray that slides in, so we can remove that during the heat of the summer. We put it back in for the shoulder seasons and winter. We can clean it off, and there's actually a lot that you can learn about your hive just by examining this bottom board, which is why I like this style so much. Also, any pests that fall down out of the hive can't get back up into the bees. So this also will help to reduce your pest load, which can be very important. Now the way this thing works is you can see that it just has a wood rim on 3 sides, no rim here. So this serves as the entrance to the hive when the box sits on top of it. So I'll sit this box back on and then show you that entrance. There, so you can see that they have a nice big entrance to go in and out of at the bottom. Now, it is a really nice big entrance, and so I used my entrance reducer yesterday. It's a good idea to get some kind of entrance reducer, especially a new hive. You don't want that entire space open for bees to fly in and out of. Basically, it's too much for them to defend. So you want to shrink that space for them. You can get commercial entrance reducers. That's what I was going to show you. You can also stuff it with anything, foam, rocks, a piece of wood that you find laying around. It doesn't really matter if the entrance that you end up leaving is right in the middle or off to one side, as long as it's smaller than that. Okay, now in this box, there are frames. And you can choose whether you are going to use 10 frame equipment, that's what this is, or 8 frame. 10 frame is by far more common. You're going to assume that everything is 10 frame unless you specify that it is 8 frame equipment. The reason someone might want to use 8 frame equipment is if you're worried about the weight of things that you might need to move around. But if you're going with 8 frame equipment, every piece is going to be narrower. So you need to specify on every hive component that you're looking for 8 frame size instead of 10. These frames that I'm talking about are a wooden frame, in some cases, I'll show you some other ones, and in it, a piece of plastic foundation. And the plastic foundation already has little kind of raised hexagon shapes in it that guide the bees where to draw the wax. It also smells amazing because it is already brushed with beeswax to give them a bit of like a head start or something to cling on to as they start to build their own wax onto this. So over time, they're going to build it up with wax. You can see that this one has more depth to it because they've built up those cells. And once they've built those cells, they reuse them over and over again. You can leave this wax in the hive and let them reuse it for about 5 years before you want to cycle it out and give them some new stuff to work with. You can do what is called foundationless beekeeping. That means that you have this wood frame part, but not the plastic foundation. That's appealing for those of us who are not huge fans of plastic, but it takes a lot more careful management. So what I would recommend is to start out with plastic and then slowly introduce some foundationless frames as you kind of move towards foundationless over the next few years. You can also get plastic all-in-ones. So this doesn't have a separate frame piece. This is all one piece of plastic that has the foundation built right in. These are nice because they don't come apart as easily sometimes, depending on how well the frames are built. By the way, you usually have to build them yourself, so how well you build them. The top piece can come off when you're prying it up out of the hive. So we have moved more towards these all-in-one pieces and find we get less breakage that way. You may also notice that this one is black and this one is yellow. I would say most foundation that you're going to see and find is yellow now. You might opt for black because it makes it easier to see eggs. So when you're doing your inspections, a tiny white bee egg stands out a lot better against a black background than against yellow. So often people will use black down in their brood boxes and yellow up in their honey boxes. We tend to mix everything all around, so we've got a little bit of everything everywhere. So those are your frames. Now, when you bring your bees home, they may come on frames. If you're buying what's called a nuke, then it's going to come on 4 or 5 frames. So 4 or 5 of your nice shiny new frames are just going to go into storage for now, and you're going to put those built frames into your hive and let the bees build out from there. If you are getting instead a package of bees, which is basically just a bunch of loose bees in a box with a queen, you're going to have all 10 frames in here, and you're quite literally just going to dump those bees in on top, and they will start to build out these frames. Now you want to have in your first year at least 2 boxes like this. So most people do kind of 2 brood box management. That means that you're going to let the queen and all of the workers who are raising young be in 2 boxes of this size. So the second one would go right on top of this one once your bees are ready. Once they have mostly filled the first one, then you throw another one on. Just so that I don't become a tiny little talking head, I'm just going to stay with 1 box as I show you the next pieces on top. But you do want 2 of these boxes with frames to get started. In your second year and beyond, you're going to need even more than those 2 boxes. You're going to need to add boxes that are specifically for honey. And we call those honey supers, even though technically there's no functional difference between a honey super and a brood box. They're the same, but some people opt for a smaller size for their honey boxes, and that's because honey is really heavy, and a box this size, that's kind of your standard deep size, can weigh 100 pounds when it's full of honey. So if that sounds like more than you want to lift off your hive, then you might choose what we call a medium box. So this one is 2/3 the height, the frames are smaller, and it weighs considerably less when it's full of honey. So as you start to order your honey boxes or your honey supers, you can choose which size you want to go with. There's some pros and cons. If you're using the same size equipment, it's really easy to move food up and down, or frames, up and down. If you find honey in the brood boxes that you want to harvest, you move it up. If you find brood in the honey supers that you don't want, you move it down. You lose that flexibility if you go with different size boxes, but it's a whole lot more manageable, especially if you're working on your own. Another common piece of equipment as you get into honey harvesting, so this is more toward your second year, this can happen in your first year if you're having a booming summer, is a queen excluder. So that's what this is. It's just a piece of, you can get them in plastic or metal, with small slits all the way across it. And the idea here is that the workers can squeeze through these holes, but the queen cannot. So if you don't want the queen to come up and lay eggs in your honey supers, then you would put this above your brood boxes to keep the brood in the bottom and your honey up top. There's all different management styles and ways to use these queen excluders, but it's definitely a worthwhile piece of equipment to have. All right, now we'll finish kind of closing up our box. So when you bring your bees home, you're going to want to feed them. You're going to want to feed them 1-to-1 syrup to help them build all of that wax on the foundation. They can't use this at all until they build the whole thing out with comb. And to do that, they need a lot of food. It takes 6 to 8 pounds of honey or nectar to make 1 pound of wax. So they need that food. And they also need nice warm weather. You can't control the weather, but you can control the food by giving them sugar syrup. So some different ways that you can put the syrup on the hive. I call these bee feeders, and I'll show you 3 different styles. This is called a sleeve feeder. So it actually goes right into the hive, and it has little holes. There's actually kind of a plastic lattice, I don't know if you can see that, down in the holes, that acts as a ladder so the bees can walk down to the water line, access the syrup, and walk back out without drowning. And this just goes right in the hive like that, in place of, usually you have to take 2 frames out. You might get lucky in your first year and only have to take 1. But as things kind of build up and gum up, it's always 2 that has to come out. Now, there's pros and cons to each of these feeders. The pro to this one is that it is right in there, easy to access for your bees. It's small. The downside to this one is that now you've removed these 2 frames, and when do they get built out? And also that you need to completely suit up and start your smoker and open the hive to check on the syrup level or refill this one. So not our personal preference. We have some of them and we use them in certain cases, but it would not be my top one to recommend to a new beekeeper. They do come in lots of beginner beekeeper kits though. The second style is kind of a pool feeder, and you'll see different colors and different configurations, but they all work in a similar way. Basically, they go on, here's the bottom of it, they go right on top of the bees, And this will be filled with sugar syrup, but the bees can't access this. Bees can't swim, so we don't want them in here. They can only access through these corner points and the middle. And hidden beneath these white things are little kind of ladders that allow them to climb down to the water line and safely back up without drowning. The benefit to this is that it holds a whole lot more than the sleeve feeder. And you don't have to open your hive to refill it. The lid would be sitting on this, and I can just crack the lid, check, I'm not accessing any bees here, refill it as needed. So this is a really nice style of feeder to use. The third option is a bucket. There's some easy DIYs for this. This is a purpose-made bucket. You can see that there's like holes under wire mesh here. You can easily rig up something like this. You can do it with a bucket this size, or you can do it with a mason jar. And all you do is take a tiny little finishing nail or a tack and poke about 10 holes in the lid, and you have made your feeder. The way that these work is with the vacuum. So when this is full of syrup and I flip it upside down, as the liquid drops, a vacuum forms up here, and that vacuum holds the liquid in. You have to trust your middle school science teacher on this one. The syrup does not come pouring out. It stays in until the bees come up to those holes and kind of suck it out. Now, this one doesn't just go on top of the frames. You need to kind of narrow the entrance. So this one goes on top of the inner cover. So I'll tell you about this inner cover piece and then show you how the feeder goes on it. So this is kind of the first lid of your hive, the first of two. It has a rim all the way around, and that's just so that you're not crushing bees when you put it on. So there's space for bees to move across the tops of the frames. And it usually has a little notch in one side. And you can choose which way that notch goes. If you put the notch on this way, then the bees have access through the top of the hive. If you put the board on this way, the bees do not have access to the top of the hive. We personally love our top entrances and we leave them open year round, so ours are always on this way. These also have usually, and it's good to get one with a hole in the top, particularly if you're going to use the bucket or jar style feeder, because that's where that goes. So you can also sometimes get little plugs for them. If you don't have a plug, then you just staple a little bit of window screen or something over that so that the bees aren't using it as another access point. So with my inner cover on, this is where I'm going to place my bucket. Now, you can either leave it just like this and throw a brick on it, on the bucket, so that when the bucket's empty, it doesn't blow away and expose your bees, because there's bees. Or you can hide it underneath an empty box like that, and then put your lid on the top. So I'll actually show you the lid piece now because it's nice and high. So this is the outer cover or the lid. It has much deeper rims. It's what we call telescoping. So it's going to sit right down over the hive, which is nice so that it doesn't have any risk of blowing away. They are usually covered in a piece of metal sheeting to give them nice long wear. And then these ones are wax dipped, so we don't paint them like we paint the rest of our hives. So then I would just sit that on top. And now my bucket is safely hidden in there and nothing's going to happen to it. We really love the bucket style of feeder. It's probably my top choice of feeder. It holds lots, especially if you do use a full bucket size. There is no risk of drowning to the bees, which is probably why it is my favorite. You do partially open the hive, so I usually have my veil on when I go out to check and refill these, because you will have a few bees hanging out around the hole there. Okay. A couple other little pieces to be at least aware of, if not add to your equipment list. One is a feeding shim. Now this is pretty easy to make yourself if you have any kind of woodworking skills, but it is basically just the exact size of your box here, but about an inch deep, and it gives space for dry feed. Now in the summer, if you're feeding your bees, it's going to be the 1-to-1 sugar syrup and occasionally some pollen. These are pollen patties. These are so hopelessly stuck together that I didn't bother prying them apart, but you can see that there are actually 4 pollen patties here, so they're quite thin when you do get them apart. These just sit right on top of the frames like this, and if you do find that they're too thick to fit under the inner cover, then a feeding shim is very helpful. In the winter, if you're worried about how much honey your bees have stored, you can't add liquid feed in the winter. You're just going to freeze your bees by adding the moisture, but you can add fondant or hard sugar that you've made into like a sugar board or a sugar brick. These are what you really need the feeding shim for because they're too wide to fit under that inner cover. So again, not real critical in your first year, maybe for your first winter, but definitely a good thing to just make and have one around. Okay, there's one more piece here. This is more of an awareness. Don't go out and buy yourself a green frame, but if you are inheriting equipment or buying equipment from someone else, or if you're just browsing the bee shop and see these and think like, hey, I like green, here's the scoop on green frames. They're not just a pretty color, they have a completely different function. And that is that they are drone frames. So the hexagonal kind of guides on these are much bigger. And when the bees build that bigger comb, it prompts the queen to lay nothing but drones. So you will end up with nothing but male bees all over this frame. People do this for a couple reasons. One, if you have a mating program and you need a whole lot more boys for your queens to mate with. Number 2 is if you want to do drone trapping to try and reduce varroa mites. And that's a whole nother lesson, but basically you wait until it's completely covered in drones and then you take it out and freeze it. The problem is if you're using this unwittingly, or if you haven't timed that perfectly, you're gonna end up with a mite bomb in your hive if all of those drones do emerge. So this is just an awareness piece. Don't add this to your must-buy list. Okay, I think I've shown you everything that I have on my table here. I am just going to show you, to finish off, the 2 different types of insulation that we use for winterizing bees. And again, I am going to have a full course on winterizing your bees coming out shortly. I already have some YouTube videos of us doing it that you can check out. But just so that if you're really keen on getting all of your gear together, you know what kind of things to add to that list. So the 2 things that we use are hot water tank wrap. This is number 1. It's basically bubble wrap with foil on either side, reflective foil. And it looks thin, but this actually works really well. It reflects the heat from the colony back into the hive. It reflects the sun away, which is counterintuitive, but really winter insulation is all about keeping a steady temperature. You don't want it to get hot in the day and cold at night. So this is one way we do it. This just comes in big rolls and then we cut and tape to the fit that we want for our hives. The other option is a commercial product. This is called, let me find the label here. This is called a Bee Cozy. It's made by Nod Apiaries, which is a Canadian company. It's nice, thick insulation. In here, it does have space for the bees to move at the entrance and even to get in and out along the seam. here, and you can get them in heights for, this is big enough to cover 2 brood boxes in the winter. You can get them half size to cover 1 brood box. So an excellent product, has worked very well for us over wintering. We have half of our hives done in these now. The only downside is how bulky they are to store when it comes to having a lot of them. So there, I think together we have built a great gear list that will get you on your way through your first season of beekeeping. Thank you for joining me.